This is Dr. Adam Weiss, and today we'll be discussing assessment in early childhood classrooms. So to begin, there's different purposes for assessment. So first of all, there could be a screening purpose where you're just trying to evaluate whether students have either grade level appropriate or age level appropriate skills. And so the screening would primarily be focusing on whether students need additional accommodations or modifications based on their hearing, sight, or cognitive abilities. Assessment in general could be just what students receive to judge and to measure their learning. And so assessments at the student level are primarily focusing on whether students are acquiring the knowledge at the appropriate pace and they have understood the instruction fully. Then there's also program level assessment, which would be more measuring whether a school or an early childhood program is being successful. Next, we have evaluation, which would be comparing either students or programs' performance with others. So we're going to talk about effective early assessments in early childhood education. And so programs that are the most effective regularly use effective assessments, and they collect that data along with screening data on students' hearing, sight, and vision. All of that data is collected to provide a holistic view of that child's development. When teachers provide assessments, we have to remember that we need to be objective as possible. Unfortunately, in some early childhood education assessments, there is a lot of room for subjectivity. Teachers are going to have to provide their interpretation of students' work or their classification of students' relative level. And so even though there is some subjectivity in our assessments in early childhood education, we want to make sure that as much as possible we are objective. So by being objective, we're following a clear criteria when we're evaluating students. We're administering the assessment in a fair and equal way for all students. And we are following up with our assessments by ensuring that they follow a rubric that has been both provided to students and to parents. Another thing we have to remember is we have to be fair and just for all students and have high expectations for all students. We also want to make sure that we inform our students of the expectations for the assessment, not only during the assessment itself, but also before the assessment. So students should know or have an idea of how they're going to be assessed later in the class. And then when they are provided the assessment, the instruction should be clear and straightforward. So early childhood students benefit from ongoing non-intrusive assessments. And there's several reasons for this. So first of all, young children might be inexperienced when it comes to formal testing or standardized assessments. And so they might not understand the importance and take it completely seriously. Another issue is if you have an overemphasis on standardized testing or high stakes evaluations, such as end of year exams or maybe a high stakes screener on students' grade level ability. These can be very stressful for students, and it can be upsetting and even overwhelm students that are not accustomed to testing. And so what could happen is they could break down, frustrated, and either give up, or they just probably will most likely not perform as well as they could if you had provide just regular ongoing assessments throughout each week that were you providing those assessments in a low stakes, stress-free classroom environment, not necessarily with a timed pencil and paper multiple choice test. Another thing is that the nice thing about ongoing assessments is that when you incorporate it into the regular classroom day, it becomes routine for students and familiar. And so students are more likely to be successful on them because they're predictable and they're not interrupting classroom instruction and distracting students. Moreover, because you're providing ongoing assessments each week throughout the year, you can measure students' growth. And so when you give results to students, it can be less focused on whether or not they passed or failed, or whether or not they performed at the appropriate level compared to their peers, but rather to focus on the progress they've made throughout the year. And you can show that progress to students, which will help develop a growth mindset in students. They can see that their effort directly corresponds to improvement and growth. Another thing is once you provide assessments to students to measure learning, you want to make sure that you take that data and you use it as an instructor to provide differentiation to students. So there's different forms of differentiation. So basically, differentiation is a way to structure and alter your instruction in various ways to meet the unique needs of learners. And so one way you can modify or differentiate your instruction is to provide different types of instruction for different learning styles. So you might have an activity that is especially beneficial for a visual learner, whereas if you have students that are kinesthetic learners that need a lot of movement and hand-eye coordination, maybe even combine that with music to that students who have a musical learning style, then you could perhaps do a chant or a song that involves movements to help students remember academic content. Another way that you could provide differentiation apart from appealing to different learning styles is you could provide accommodations or modifications for students. So some accommodations might be additional time, or modifying the text so that it's at students' reading level, perhaps providing them with additional support materials like manipulatives, hands-on counters to help them solve math tests. All of these things are forms of accommodations. You could even also modify assessments modify instruction based on students' needs. So if you notice that you have a student that has that struggles with more complex work, you might just break down the assessment or the assignment into one or two steps, one or two items, and then later give them a brief pause or a break, and then regroup and do the rest of the assignment. Another part of differentiation is providing language support to your English language learners. So once you've administered that assessment and you see that students are struggling with some of those academic language concepts, or they just need additional support, maybe additional practice in writing or speaking complete sentences, or providing details, or they need help with pronunciation or with their grammar. All of those things you can provide in small groups as differentiation support for English language learners. Another thing is you can differentiate your instruction based on students' home experiences and home cultures. So if you notice that several of your students are confused on a topic because they haven't experienced this situation culturally, let's say you had a week-long unit on Thanksgiving, and you have many students that don't celebrate Thanksgiving or have a different form of fall harvest festival in their culture. Well, you could try to relate that instruction to students' native culture by finding out what are fall festivals in their countries or their home cultures, and explain it that way to students so that they can connect to the content. So when you provide assessments to students, you want to make sure that you provide them inside the classroom itself. That way students feel comfortable. When you take students outside of the classroom, in general, that can cause distractions or can lead to a break in routine, which can upset many students. And also, assessments should be conducted during a time period and during a day that is an average school day that does not have a lot of interruptions. So in general, the best time to provide assessments to young students is to provide it during the middle of the week, because if you provide it in the beginning of the week, on Monday or even Tuesday, students might still be recovering from a long weekend maybe they had with their family if it was very busy, and they might not have gotten enough sleep during the weekend. And then if you provide an assessment on Thursday or Friday, students might be busy, excited about the upcoming weekend, or be tired from a long week of school if they've had to work really hard throughout the school week cognitively to understand that new content information. And then, of course, you also want to avoid special days of the year where maybe there's like different celebrations or events in the school, like guest speakers or assemblies or field trips. Anything that could cause a distraction that could make the day unusual, you want to avoid assessing students during that time period because they might be distracted and they might not perform their best. Another thing to remember is that before you provide an assessment to your students, you want to make sure that you've already developed a positive individual relationship with each student. You don't want to provide an assessment the very first 3 days, even first week, or maybe even 2 weeks of school, because you want to use that time to build a classroom community, to develop relationships that are positive and professional with students, and you also want to have that background relationship with students so that when they receive an assessment, they feel motivated to complete and be successful on that assessment because they want to impress the teacher. Also, if you have that safe, comfortable, relaxing, and supportive, positive professional relationship with students, students will feel supported and they won't feel that the assessment is a stressful occurrence where they're being observed and watched and scrutinized, but rather it's an opportunity for them to demonstrate what they know. And so the more and more positive and supportive the relationship you have with students, the more likely they're going to view assessment as something positive and something that can support their learning rather than something that is stressful and upsetting. Another thing to remember is when you're providing assessments to students, you want to make sure that they've had several different opportunities to see the material. They've been exposed to it in class, they've practiced with it both in class with their peers, with their teacher, maybe with their parents, and then also on their own. This way you know that they're going to be successful on the assessment. And if they're successful on the assessment, that will build students' self-esteem, and it will also just make you a teacher more effective, because you don't want to be only teaching a concept 1 or 2 times and then assess students, because students are not likely to do so well on that assessment. And so you might have taught that content very well during those 1 or 2 times, but just the number of practice and repetitions was not sufficient. And that could be an explanation for why students underperformed on the assessment. Not necessarily your instructional practices and activities, but rather just the lack of exposure and practice with the content. So to avoid that, you want to just provide students regular and frequent opportunities to practice with the skills before they're assessed on it. Another thing is effective assessments also must be valid or have validity, so they truly need to assess what they're attempting to assess. I know that sounds kind of common sense or straightforward, but basically, if you're going to have an assessment on a particular learning objective, let's say students' ability to write a complete sentence, you're going to make sure that you are assessing students on the different parts of a sentence or how to write a complete thought, capitalization, punctuation, correct grammar, but you're going to make sure that you're measuring what students are supposed to be understand. You're not going to have a test. If your test is to measure whether or not students can write a complete sentence, then you wouldn't want to provide them part of the test where they're reading complete sentences and they're trying to comprehend a complete text, which would be kind of going above and beyond what they're actually supposed to be assessed on during the assessment. So you want to make sure that when you provide an assessment on a particular topic, it's covering all the objectives you taught to students. It accurately measures whether students understand the concept. And a good way to determine if it accurately measures if students understand the concept is to make your assessment multidimensional. So having several different parts of an assessment within an assessment that have different types of questions or activities. It could be short answer questions. It could be multiple choice. It could be students drawing a picture to represent their knowledge, students doing a presentation of what they've learned, students writing a short essay or a short passage on what they learned, students doing a creative project like a poster or a piece of art in which they explain it to the class, or they complete a demonstration. All of these things are multidimensional assessments, and that they incorporate several different types of questions and activities within the same assessment so that students of different learning styles are successful. And that makes it more likely for the assessment to be valid. Because if it's providing various opportunities for different students to be to demonstrate their knowledge, to be successful on the assessment, then it's more likely going to be valid in determining whether or not students understood that content. If they only assess students in one way through multiple choice questions or through writing an essay, that might not be able to support other types of students that maybe struggle with writing or with reading. And so they might have understood the content, but because in the format they were assessed, they were not as successful as if they would have been provided a multi-dimensional assessment. So effective assessment needs to be valid. It needs to measure what it's intending to measure and cover the desired learning objectives. Another part about validity also is the concept that when you're incorporating certain screening assessments or readiness assessments that come from either your district or come from outside sources, make sure that they're supported by academic research. Most of the major purchased options for assessment or readiness have been supported by research, but you can just do a brief Google search just to see many of these different assessments, like the Lexile measure, for example, is a way, it has been proven by research or supported by research to measure students' reading level. So there's different studies that can support assessments, and just keep that in mind to make sure you pick an assessment that has been shown by research to be valid. Another thing is you want to make sure your assessments are reliable. So by that, the directions, the format, and the way that the test is administered should be uniform and the same for all students. And so basically, a reliable test would mean that you would get similar results regardless of when you gave that test, what situation it was administered, and who administered the test. So a reliable test would likely give you the same results if the classroom teacher administered it, if a professional testing administrator administered it, or maybe the principal administered it, versus, and the same thing, it would be reliable if regardless of when the teacher administered it during the day or during the week, students overall did more or less, scored more or less the same. That would be a reliable assessment. Now, it doesn't mean that we're going to avoid best practices that we talked about earlier. So teachers should be the ones that are administering assessments because students have the strongest relationship with their classroom teacher, and they'll feel more comfortable. And the same thing about what we said about ideally you want to administer assessments during the middle of the week, during a non-special class day, and also during the morning in general, because that's when students have the most energy. So let's talk about the different types of assessments. So you're going to be providing different types of assessments as an early childhood educator, and it's important to note that you're going to provide different types. So first of all, we have formative assessments. So formative assessments are primarily for the teacher. they're not always collected for a grade, or even you might share what students have done correctly or incorrectly with the student, but you might not always report that grade to them as like a letter grade or a number grade. Instead, formative assessments in general occur daily or at least several times a week. And in general, you're going to provide these formative assessments after you finish completing teaching one particular topic or one particular objective, and then you're going to give this assessment to see whether or not students understood that concept. And so formative assessments are primarily for you, the teacher, to determine whether you can move on to teaching a new topic, or if many students didn't do well in the formative assessment, you need to stop pause from continuing into more complicated material and instead reteach the concept in a different way. So once you've gotten your data from your formative assessment, then you're going to use that to differentiate. So you're going to provide remediation and additional support and reteaching for those who are unsuccessful, and you're going to make sure you reteach it in a different way because the first way was not successful for students. And in general, remediation and reteaching is most effective, if possible, in small groups or even individually. Another thing that you'll do is, based off formative assessments, if students do really well on the formative assessment, then you can provide those students enrichment or more challenging, more rigorous work or assignments or concepts to teach for those students because they are at an advanced level. So an example of a formative assessment might be like a daily quiz after you've had students complete or listened to the lesson and done some practice problems. Or it might be an exit ticket where students write down 3 things they learned from the day. Or it could even be an oral presentation where students present a short 30 seconds of the key main takeaways or main ideas of the lesson. Another thing that you'll provide to students, but less frequently, are summative assessments. Summative assessments are generally conducted in much longer time spans compared to formative assessments. So summative assessments sum up the learning, and they normally cover several concepts or several objectives in one test. And so normally they're going to be offered at the end of every month or every 6 weeks or even every semester or even every year. Summative assessments often are longer because they're covering more concepts, more skills, and they provide an overall summary of students' knowledge on these grade level topics. Now, the thing about summative assessments is, since they're more broad and they cover several different skills and they're longer, it's going to take a little bit more work from the teacher to really break down student results and then use those results to modify the teacher's instruction. So you're going to need to disaggregate or analyze your summative data by making sure that you separate it based on each student and also each individual learning objective, to see which objective students did well upon and which particular students did well and which students need additional support overall and in what particular objectives. So it's very important that as an early childhood educator, you provide authentic assessments. So authentic assessments provide you with data over a long period, not just one day or one time period. Moreover, authentic assessments focus on various skills. They're multidimensional in that they have several different types of questions or activities, but also they focus on several different developmental domains. So they're not only going to assess students on academic information, but they're also going to assess other skills like communicative skills or physical kinesthetic coordination skills, or even maybe their interpersonal communication skills. Authentic assessment should occur in the natural learning environment where students have been learning the concepts. So if you've been teaching a science lesson primarily in the school garden or outside, then you might also be likely to conduct your assessment in that learning environment because that's what they're familiar with. However, if you've done a lot of instructional inside the classroom, then you should provide your assessment within your own classroom. Another thing about authentic assessments, and this is very important, is that authentic assessments are focused upon providing real-world functional tasks that students can directly relate to their everyday life and their everyday real-world experiences. So they can see the relevance of what they're doing, and they can see that the assessment is something that they would see in their daily lives. And it should be something that's functional. So, adding on to that, authentic assessments are criterion-based. So they're focused on whether or not students can complete a given skill or task, rather than how students compare to their peers or whether they passed or failed. It's more of like, can they write a personal narrative about their favorite day? Or can they add one-digit numbers using manipulatives? Or can they explain the water cycle orally in using academic vocabulary they've learned? So all of these things are specific skills or tasks that students could complete, and it's not saying which students are better than others or whether students passed or failed per se. It's whether or not they can complete these given skills and tasks. And if they cannot, how can we support them to attain these skills or be able to complete these tasks? So we've already talked about it, but authentic assessments provide beneficial data that will allow you to give specific targeted remediation or additional differentiation for students who need it. Authentic assessments are also collaborative in nature, not necessarily because students are doing them with partners per se, but they're collaborative in that all stakeholders, teachers, families, and students understand the relevance and importance of the assessment, and they're having feedback and input in creating the assessment, and they're also receiving the results of the assessment and follow-up activities to help them continue to improve. So now we're going to get into some various types of assessments that you might see in your early childhood classroom. We've already talked about screening assessments. Remember, that's primarily used to see whether students have grade level appropriate cognitive skills, as well as physical capabilities like hearing, vision, or even like some cognitive skills like developmental cognitive skills. Another type of assessment that's somewhat related is a readiness assessment. And a readiness assessment would be basically whether students are at grade level in terms of their content knowledge. So it's a norm reference test. It's directly comparing students to a norm or an average, what the average first grader would know about math at this level, or what would be the average fluency words per minute that the average second grader could read in the second month of second grade. So it's comparing students together, but it's determining whether students have readiness in terms of on-grade level ability. You also can have different types of just teacher observations. You have the structured observations where the teacher sets a particular time period and they formally conduct the observation, document it. And then you could also have unstructured observations where teachers kind of just informally, when they can, observe students. They still note behaviors, but unstructured observations have a little bit, they don't have to be routine at the same time of day and at the same location. They give more flexibility to the teacher. One thing to note is that when you are observing students, you want to be as objective and honest as possible. You want to just observe students in that moment. You don't want to involve preconceived notions of either the student or what the student has done before. So you don't want to have any biases you might have where, based on students' prior performance, maybe they did really well on another assessment that was related, or maybe they did really well in the practice, or maybe they performed really well in performed really poorly in many assessments before this, but now this is a new assessment. You can't take your preconceived notions of students, whether they're going to be successful, whether they already know the content, or whether they will underperform. All of these are preconceptions, preconceived notions that you can't allow you can't allow to interfere with your observations. Your observations should be what you observed objectively during that specific time period, not what you've experienced before with the student. Another type of assessment would be sociograms. This would be where a teacher provides students with different pictures of classmates, and students indicate which two students they get along with the most and they have a positive relationship with. And this is not obviously that academic based. It's more of just helping assess students' social abilities. And the main thing is just to help students who maybe are struggling to develop positive relationships with their peers. So if a student was rarely mentioned by another peer as being someone they like to work with or spend time with, then that student maybe is lacking some social skills, or maybe they're lacking just positive relationships with their peers, and so you, the teacher, can help facilitate that. Another type of assessment could be anecdotal records, where you would write down specific observations you've seen. Then you would interpret your observation based on your understanding of childhood development. And this would be also another thing to note, is that it doesn't provide solid conclusions. You couldn't really provide a conclusion unless you observed it several different times and there was the same behavior over and over. So an anecdotal assessment might be, maybe the teacher writes out that they observed that the student is organizing figures based on color and based on based on color, and also based on whether they are square shaped versus triangle shaped. Well, so this shows you that the student, an interpretation of this could be that the student understands the difference between a triangle and a rectangle. They know how to differentiate between the two, and they also know how to differentiate between the two with different colors. So that could be your interpretation. There are students understanding that there are different colors, and you can classify objects based on colors, and you can also classify objects based on 3D shapes, and students know how to classify objects based on whether they're a triangle or a rectangle in that case. Frequency counts could be where you're noting how many times students have done a specific behavior, maybe how many times students chose to reread their favorite book, or how many times students asked for help, or how many times students wrote a complete sentence in their writing that had correct capitalization and punctuation. That would be a frequency count. A KWL chart for each student would be a nice assessment. And so KWL charts provide both a pre-assessment, and a post-assessment. So if the KWL stands for it's like an abbreviation. So K stands for, or an acronym, excuse me. So K stands for what students already know about a topic. W is what students want to know about a topic. And then the L stands for what students learned during the lesson. So the new information. So you can provide the K part of the assessment and the W part of the assessment before you've started the lesson. So that could the K would tell you what students already know, so their prior knowledge on the topic from earlier years or from home experiences. And then the W could also help students focus their attention and their interest in the current lesson. That could also tell you a little bit more about what students know from their background knowledge, because if they have some experience with that topic, then they're probably going to know what areas they want to learn more about. Finally, after you've presented the new information, you can have students reflect on their learning by explaining what were some new concepts they learned. That can be a way for you to find out whether they obtained the key concepts of the lesson. You could have checklists and inventories. These normally have various different behaviors or skills, and then so you're assessing several skills at once or several behaviors at once. And then you can also use notes and how frequent students complete these activities to help you with a checklist or inventory. So sometimes teachers will administer a reading inventory where they administer, they look at different reading habits, like how many books students read over the month, how maybe students read a passage and the teacher notes maybe students' performance, their reading fluency, how many words per minute they read, how many miscues. So that could be a reading inventory that assesses not only just reading performance, but also students' reading interests. Another type is a rating scale or rubric. So this would be basically you provide some comparative terms like less developed, somewhat developed, more developed, frequently observed, or fully developed. All of these are comparative terms, and you would basically rate students on either their behavior, their knowledge, or their acquisition of a skill based on that scale or rubric. It's important that, once again, you want to make sure you have a clear criteria rubric to assess students. That way you're not just being subjective and saying, oh, this student's more developed than the other, or more developed, but you don't really have a justification for it. It's not clear. Participation charts are nice because it can show how many times students answered questions, or how many times they interacted with other students, or how many times they chose to participate in particular activities. So this can kind of show you who students feel most comfortable with, what are their academic interests, and also how comfortable they feel answering questions and participating in class. We have running records, and this is kind of something similar to what I mentioned with the reading inventory. Just the reading inventory would include other things like students' reading interests, maybe their reading level, the books they've read at home. So the reading inventory would be a little bit more comprehensive. Running records are more specific, and they're focused on oral reading tests. So they're focusing on students' reading accuracy and students' reading fluency. So by accuracy, it's looking about how often students say words or code or decode words correctly. So another way to think of it is how many miscues students had compared to how many total words they read correctly. Another thing is reading fluency, so how many words students could read per minute. And then some running records will also include some reading comprehension questions at the end, but not all include that. And then you also could have child-teacher mini-conferences where you ask students to come up, or you can even have a small group discussion where you just have a discussion with students about what they learned. You can ask them some guided questions. You can give them some feedback, and you can even provide support if they have any misconceptions. But you're asking students questions in a small group or even individually, and so you can get a better grasp of what students understand on a concept by doing that interview. Eco-maps are interesting. That's primarily for you, the teacher, to learn about students' home life, because basically it's like a graphic organizer, like a bubble map or a schematic map where you're indicating different people in students' lives and how they relate. Like, is it a positive relationship, negative relationship, or what impact they have on that student's education. And you can do eco-maps primarily with parents. Parents will help you complete that. Another type of assessment could be self-appraisal by students. So students could be provided a checklist or a rubric, and they could measure themselves that way. They could self-evaluate. And this would be useful if you conducted it throughout the year, because that way students can note their progress and reflect on their growth as a student and what particular areas they need to improve. And they can see also what areas they should focus upon, because if you're giving them this specific self-appraisal on this one task or this concept, students know, hey, this task or concept is important because I'm going to be evaluating myself throughout the year. so I'm going to improve on it. Another type of assessment could be standardized tests. Those are like end of year exams or semester exams. Those should probably be less focused upon or less emphasized in early childhood classrooms for the reasons we mentioned earlier. Diagnostic assessments are another type, and this would be what you provide to students at either the beginning of the year or at the beginning of a new unit to assess their new knowledge, to assess their prior knowledge from either the year before or from earlier lessons or from their home life. So this gives you a better idea of what students' background knowledge is and whether or not you need to reteach or go back a little bit and focus on the foundational knowledge before you introduce new concepts that are more challenging. Portfolios are a wonderful way to assess students. They are ongoing, so they're authentic in that they include real-world tasks or activities that are meaningful to students. They provide various opportunities for students to demonstrate their best, not just have one snapshot or one opportunity where students could have just a bad day and that ruins the whole assessment. Instead, portfolios are collected throughout the year, so students are more likely to show what they truly know and to perform well. Portfolios also are multidimensional, so they have different types of assessments or different types of tasks or assignments. You could be creative work like drawings or plays. It could be writings. It could be completed assignments, completed quizzes. It could be pictures of students' work or videos of students' performances. It could be educational presentations like posters or PowerPoints that students made, or visuals or models they made. Portfolios should be a collaborative process, so you should have students help you construct the portfolios, help select the work samples, and you should also let students reflect on their progress in completing their portfolio. And this way, students can recognize their achievements, what they've done well, and their strengths, and also what learning goals they might have in the future to make their portfolio even better. Then portfolios should be shared with parents and families, and this way can develop a sense of pride in students that they can have the opportunity to show their work to their family, and it shows also to students to recognize what they've achieved throughout the year, and they'll feel more productive. Moreover, portfolios should also be dated, like the information, the samples should be dated. That way students can also see the order and their progression, and they can see how much they've improved throughout the year. Part of portfolios, or a nice follow-up activity for once students complete portfolios, is to have student-led conferences. So this is basically when students organize and work together with the teacher to invite their family to come to class to see their work. It's a happy celebratory occasion, and the teacher is more there just as a facilitator or guide. The student is the one talking about what they learned, what they did, showing it to their family, and guiding their family through the learning process. There's 3 steps. The preparatory period is the students and the teacher working together to develop the portfolios, select the best work to showcase for each student. Students practice presenting their work to their peers so they get an idea of how they're going to present to their families and describe their work and what they learned. Then, of course, you need to inform families and advertise the event. That's all part of the preparatory period. Next is the celebration, where you actually have the event and the parents come and the families come, and each student has an opportunity and sufficient time to present their work to the group. And this can even include documentation boards or portfolios where students have pictures, videos, collected samples of their work to directly show their parents. And then if possible, and if appropriate, you could allow students to present their work in their native language to their family if they feel that would be more beneficial for parents. And then at the end of the student-led conferences, the final process or the final step is the debriefing. So this is once the families have left and then maybe the next day or two in class, you come together, or you meet individually or in small groups of students, and ask them to reflect on how they felt the event went, what parts they enjoyed, what ideas they might have for future events, what activities or products they'll continue to develop now to show to their families for the next celebration, and what they can improve upon on their own time so they can later show to their families and to their teacher. So those are all the different assessments you could have in early childhood classrooms. Remember, you want to make sure you provide authentic assessments to students and that they're ongoing for the most part. Those are the best types of assessments for early childhood classrooms. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in another video. Have a good day.